Good morning, preppers. Happy Sunday to you. We're trying something brand new on the channel, and I think this could absolutely be advantageous because podcasts are wonderful where you can get a shower, wash some dishes, do whatever you need to, and just kind of listen in. And it's something I've been considering for quite a while. And even more so, this specific podcast, not to mention, I want you to put comments below to tell me if you like it or not, or some other topics for this. But I find this specific podcast is important for the fact that we need to look at the State of the Union. And not the State of the Union that this president or any other president, mind you, will tell you what's going on, because they always want to make it look like, oh, the State of the Union is great. The last thing a president's going to do is say, oh, the State of the Union is really bad. I mean, they'll tell you some things we need to change, perhaps. But for you and me, I find the State of the Union today, right now, is absolutely in a horrible situation. And that's what I want to get into and talk about this. So go ahead and grab yourself a nice cup of coffee or a cup of tea and some snacks and have a seat and sit down and just kind of relax. And more than anything, I want to put us through a frame of mind shift so we can start seeing all the things that are happening in the world today and how this absolutely mirrors. It looks just like what I see in pre-World War II. I mean, even going back further, really, and realistically speaking, we're talking about the Great Depression. Now, there's so many things we can talk about, and this podcast could last for probably an hour if we needed to put all the information in there. But I definitely want to narrow it down a little bit and talk about some of the different talking points that we're seeing right now and how we're actually, in my opinion, being lied to. And for the fact that they are trying to tell us that everything is going just fine right now. Yeah, we may have a little inflation, but we're not in any type of recession. Or yeah, we see some saber rattling, or yeah, we see some problems with Russia and Ukraine, but you know what? It's all being taken care of. You American, or where you're from, maybe you Brit or you Canadian, just sit back. You know what? Give us all your rights and your freedoms, and you can sit back and go back to using your little PS5 and your virtual reality or your favorite television show, and don't worry about things because everything's just fine. But things are not just fine. I mean, that's the reason we're on this channel. That's the reason you're watching us. That's the reason that we all join together and see everything that's happening, because by any means, things are not fine right now. Just the opposite. Things are catastrophically bad. And that's hard to say for me because I'm an optimist. I love seeing the best in the world. I definitely love seeing the best in people. But when I talk about making a video for Goshen Prepping, I see the fear out there. I see the problems out there and the mayhem that's happening. And for the fact that I'm sure you can relate with this is not how things used to be. America is changing right before our eyes. And all the things that our fathers warned us about, our grandfathers, all those things that they said, watch out for this, are happening right before our eyes. And not only happening before our eyes, but we're seeing that today's youth and the culture going up. And it's, of course, attributed to this horrible education system that is being pushed down our throats. Our youth are following right along in with this. And I'm certainly not blaming educators themselves. Of course, you're going to have good and bad in every single type of employment. But educators themselves are being pushed down this mandate where they're really trying to have an agenda. There's an agenda being set forth in the education system, because if you want to change a future generation, you start with our kids. And that goes for you too, parents, by the way. Our education system is set up where, you know what, let's change the youth for an America that we want differently in the future, which is happening now, mind you. But as parents, it is our sole responsibility and, in my opinion, our honor to bring up our children to follow in a way that we think is going to be best fit, advantageous, not just for the individual, but for we the people and our government system together. We're definitely in trying times. And I'm going to go ahead and point out a few different things that we're looking at as far as these trying times in which we need to, try to prepare for what's coming. And this is hard because, we're a prepping channel and we want you to be prepared for everything. But the word try here is such a vital word for the fact that there may be some things coming that we may not be able to do anything about. And I guarantee there are some things coming that we can't do anything about at all. But how do we prepare for it? It's going to be difficult to prepare for a lot of these things. Now, the first thing, and go ahead and start when we talk about Russia and Ukraine and the whole situation there. And there's so many people who are pro-Russia. And I personally am pro-Russian people. I believe the Russian people are held in this dictatorship in which they literally, practically speaking, have no say in what's happening at all. Protests break out there, just like in the United States, but in Russia, the protests break out and they're immediately arrested. In the United States, protests break out, and they even call them protests, even though they advance much beyond that. And now we have district attorneys who refuse to even prosecute those situations. So we're actually in just the opposite, in a worse situation. But there is no, practically speaking, quote unquote, freedoms in Russia that we have here in America. I know a lot of people right now are vomiting a little bit in their mouth saying freedoms in America. Yes, freedoms in America. We still have a quote unquote free country. There are so many things we can do in this country that you cannot do in a lot of other countries, especially Russia. Now, those freedoms are disappearing, and disappearing quickly, and it is something we need to fight against drastically to make sure we don't turn in that situation. But it's amazing how the pro-Russian people come out. And listen, they're simply getting this from the pro-Russian agents that basically are pushing through cyber warfare, pushing all this agenda on Facebook and on YouTube. And even like all these YouTube channels, which some of them really big, keep talking about how, Russia, they're such a good people fighting against the New World Order, fighting against the United Nations, fighting against the WEF. And I'm with you. I hate those things. All that stuff is horrible. But look, just because right now we have somebody sitting in the Oval Office, which I'm reluctant to say the word president for that man, mind you. I don't believe that's the case. But he's in the Oval Office. In that situation, he is continuously pushing these things as well. But that doesn't mean the United States as a whole. It certainly doesn't mean all the people. And it doesn't mean all the people who are elected to government follow that agenda. They certainly don't. In Russia, if you don't follow their agenda, it's called not being part of their system at all. And it's amazing how people talk so good about Russia. Russia is great for this and this and this. If it's so good, then why is it through communist Russia especially, but even today, so many people are trying to get out? Why is that? If it's such an amazing system, then why are people leaving? And if it's such an amazing system where it's for the people, we're for the people, why is Putin one of the richest men in the world? Those are questions you seriously need to ask. Or if you're even contemplating saying, socialism might be good, you need to realize that people in socialism, they don't have that choice to say socialism is good or bad. They say it's good, or they suffer the consequences. All right, now with that socialism, I'm not saying there aren't some benefits to socialism or communism. Sure, there's some things that actually could be helpful. I mean, they try to make it so it doesn't matter what your job is, one job for everybody, one pay for everybody. But I don't know if you know it, but the Russians actually had a saying back in the day of communism, I'm sure it still holds today, that they pretend to pay us, so we pretend to work. There's nothing better than a free market economy to really spur on growth. Economic growth, technological growth. And that's basically what America has taken pride in for so many years, is this growth, because this is a country where you can still become a millionaire. I mean, a millionaire is not what it used to be anyway, but you can still do very well. All of those hopes are completely 100% shattered in a socialistic, communistic country. You can't do it at all. So why have goals? Why push forward? Why try to better our country? Where instead, now they actually invade Ukraine, and they instead conscript people by the hundreds of thousands to go fight into a war that basically right now is heading into a stalemate. It's a bad situation. And again, I'm not saying America is great. I say the United States of America is great, but our current situation, our State of the Union right now is really bad. We're in a bad situation. So let's go ahead and talk about Russia and Ukraine for a moment and see the really dire situation we're in. Because Russia, and we've said this many times on the channel, you're welcome to disagree, of course you are, but Russia has actually said, Putin has actually said that our goal isn't because NATO is on our doorstep. Do they hate NATO? Of course they do. But it's not about NATO's on the doorstep. It's for the fact that Ukraine joining NATO, Putin views Ukraine as part of Russia. They have for a long time. That's what it comes down to. And don't think that if Putin, by miraculous chance, goes over and takes over all of Ukraine, he's going to stop there. Because Putin, no matter how much he comes across as being the leader, he is not. You still have some old Soviet types who are basically pushing his buttons and his agenda, telling him to be more of a hardliner and get in there. And we're seeing all kinds of problems already kicking in, like Putin has some kind of medical disease, or, you know what, the hardliners are getting upset with him. What's really happening behind the scenes, mind you, and you have to understand this, is they're telling him, you better get going with this or you're out of there. And we're going to get going with this with somebody else. And we're seeing things like tactical nukes being moved to Belarus, and Putin making this clear. We're seeing things with him saying, oh, if you actually use some spent uranium shells on us, that's just an excuse so they can actually step it up to the next level and use tactical nukes. Why would they do that? Because they're in a stalemate. Putin wants to push across the country even further, and he's not going to stop at the edge of Ukraine. And it's not specifically because of NATO. Some of the hardliners want to restore the Soviet Empire. Do you realize that these hardcore Soviets, including Putin himself, admit the worst thing that ever happened to the Soviet Empire was the fall of the Berlin Wall? They say that all the time. It is something they stand by, that this incredible, huge conglomerate of the Soviet Union fell, and therefore they lost their identity. They lost what they stood for. And there is one thing about Russia, except for just simply being hard people, is they are proud people, exceedingly proud in what they do. So with that, Putin cannot be backed into a corner. If for some reason Ukraine is not lost, and Ukraine, through the use of military weapons from the United States and other countries, is able to push back the Russians, first off, Putin is not going to be limited to conventional weapons. He will take it to the next level. But even furthermore, we're going to see nothing short of the entire Russian Empire, Russia itself, collapsing economically speaking. And could you imagine being that Russian leader like Putin and letting that happen? They're not going to let that happen. That's what's going to happen if that goes that way. But they'll never let that happen. So they're going to push on. Ukraine very well could be taken over by Russia. If you want my opinion, I believe that's what's going to happen. And then we see a whole host of other countries that are next on their doorstep as they rally as that proud country. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Romania, Finland, all these countries see what's happening there. And it's funny how Americans were like, oh, Putin's a good guy. I know most of the people on the channel do not say that. If that's the case, then why do we see countries right now scrambling to try to join NATO? You need to ask yourself that. Because they're brainwashed and thinking NATO is good? They're brainwashed because they think United States is good? They fear for their life. And that's a situation that is something that people need to grasp. I welcome opinions. If you come on and say, my opinion is, I think Russia is doing this, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But you start pushing your agenda, you're just a Russian bot. You're a useful idiot. Now, the sanction we placed on Russia, those sanctions did not quite have the effect we were hoping they would. And when we see Europe having a difficult time because they're not getting enough fuel, and even gas prices because of this going way up in America, it's not really having the effect on Russia we thought it would, because Russia produces a ridiculous amount of fuel and oil every day. And they ship it out. Off it goes. And who is buying it? China. And if we stop that flow because of Siberia and because of the coldness on there, it would actually make their equipment crash. And therefore, they'd actually have to rebuild a lot of it. And that's actually what happened with the fall of the Soviet Empire, late 80s, early 90s. The whole system crashed, but they've rebuilt it since then. But if they actually stop the flow of that fuel oil, you're going to see some freezing equipment because of the temperatures there, and it's going to take them years to rebuild it. So Russia has no choice but to continue to try to push out their fuel oil and sell it to countries that does not go against them, for example, China. Now, it's difficult for Russia to get a lot of the oil to China, so they put it in some of the ships coming out of Russia itself, and some of those ships are not made to cross the Pacific Ocean. And so what they'll do is they actually have this huge, barge in the middle of the ocean in which they take those ships, transfer it to that barge, and then there's actually larger ships that take it to China. And that's been very difficult for them because you're asking for an explosion. You're asking for some problems to kick in. And so to make things more streamlined and help it out, Russia and China have just now announced a pipeline going straight from Russia down to China so they can actually fuel China, literally their military or anything they want, with a straight shot, not having to worry about ships at all. And because of this, right now, of course, the United States being the world order dominant country, the American dollar has actually held for, 70 years going across the globe, more than that. And Russia and China, especially because of the sanctions, want no part of this. So as we see them going away on the wayside, not using American currency and going against American sanctions, they're asking themselves, then why are we using American dollars? Why don't we use the Chinese yuan? Why don't we actually use the Russian ruble? And that's exactly what they're doing. So they are now subverting the American dollar, which is actually making it so the American dollar, we're seeing the very first steps of the American dollar going downhill, not being the dominant dollar in the world. And we mentioned many times on the channel that the New World Order will kick in. And this New World Order is not some mysterious, conglomerate that basically everybody's always been worrying about, even though I'm not saying that won't happen. I'm not saying that a one world government may not kick in, but the New World Order is simple. Right now, the United States is the top of the New World Order. They're the top of the world order, and they took it from the Brits in the late 40s. And before that, it was taken from the Dutch. And before that, and the list goes on and on and on. It's been going on for a long, long time. And there's only one thing we do see is that when a country does go through a phase of becoming the world order, they always actually go through an amazing incline of basically doing incredibly well across the world. Then their bubble burst and everything starts crashing and national debt kicks in and down it goes. And that is absolutely where we see the United States right now. And of course, the question would be is, well, who's going to take over for that New World Order? What's the New World Order going to look like? Is it going to be Russia? Is it going to be China? Is it going to be the Arab states? It's difficult to say, isn't it? Well, we do see things already kicking in because when we talk about Russia and China exchanging this oil and they're no longer using the dollar, well, there's the first steps of another economic powerhouse coming to place, and that would be China. Russia did not want China to take that place of the New World Order. But because of their economy and the sanctions and everything, they said, you know what? We may not have a choice here. China is growing like wildfire. I don't mean population. I mean technologically. I mean economically. And even though their economy is not doing amazing right now because of their COVID lockdowns, they are doing very well economically. And as their COVID lockdowns are shutting down and there's going to be more freedom in trade across the country, they're going to explode even more. And Russia sees this. And Russia basically finally, as far as the Chinese see it, finally bowed down and said, okay, you take the reins, buy our oil. And so therefore Russia is actually really picking up economically speaking because China is buying so much oil from Russia. China is growing like crazy. Now, compared to the United States, we still have an incredible budget compared to China. And I'm not talking about the budget that Biden keeps just taking dollars and spending like crazy, but overall, our gross domestic product is incredible compared to China. Unfortunately, we just keep buying all their crap, all their semiconductor chips, everything that they actually have. We are one big fat nation that keeps buying crap from everybody. We just want to sit back and have everything at our fingertips and never have to get up and go to work a job again. That's the United States right now. We're one big fat cow. We're not the sleeping giant. We're the giant fat person sitting in a lazy chair. That's the problem. And that's where we're at in the United States. And you know what? China is a mover and shaker. And technologically speaking, they're growing like crazy. So it's just a matter of time before they are there militarily as well. They actually have a lot of soldiers in China. Of course they do. But technologically speaking, they do not match us. They do have a 5th generation jet, which is pretty impressive, but they're limited as far as how many they have. It probably has nothing in comparison to our F-22 or F-35, but they do have technology that's increasing, and that's the key. They're increasing. And what are we doing in the United States? Yes, we're developing a hypersonic missile. But instead, we keep seeing budget cuts saying the F-22 and F-35 is just too expensive to keep, not to mention the ridiculous amount we actually have for our technological missiles. High-tech missiles are so expensive, and we've sent so many armaments to Ukraine, the United States is hurting militarily. Now, I'm going to be so clear about this. I'm not saying the United States is not a good opponent against China. China has 3 aircraft carriers. One used to be Russian, one they converted from another ship, and their third one, which is their new generation one, is looking pretty cool, but it's still not nuclear power. And if you don't understand that, nuclear power when it comes to those is vitally important because you can go for years without having to stop and refuel. That way they can actually spend more placement inside that ship to have fuel for the jets themselves. Not to mention, they're really trying to find the pilots who can launch these jets off the front of the aircraft carriers. And you know what? I'm going to be first to say they're having a difficult time with this. But they're pushing it, and that's the direction they're heading. They're heading to a situation in which they're trying to be the military power of the world. You compare their 3 carriers, which are not really much, technologically speaking, compare that to the 11 carriers we have in the United States. They don't stand a chance against our carriers. That's all there is to it. It's as simple as that. And if you disagree with that, you seriously need to do some research, because our carriers, our military, even though we're having troubles, is still amazing. The problem is their military is increasing and our military is decreasing. And at least our top generals, which I do not have a lot of respect for, I admit, are trying to do things like establish bases in the Philippines, increase our base activity in South Korea, in Japan, Okinawa, and also in Australia. And those are areas in which China simply does not like. China tried to strike a deal with Australia and it fell through. And now the United States, we're actually sending military equipment there. So we are building up our military forces in the Pacific to defend Taiwan. And I've had people on the channel say, well, here's the thing. Why would Taiwan? What do we care? Trust me, we care. This is not simply about America, let's shut our doors. We are in already a one world government per se. And I'm not talking about the United Nations. I'm talking about our trade. You can't go back to a day where suddenly America shuts its doors and we never talk to anybody else outside of us again. Although I'm not saying I wouldn't possibly support such a measure. But Taiwan is our main support for some high-tech semiconductor chips. Not to mention, they are an independent nation. They're not part of China anymore. They are separate, and they're sovereign, and they have a right to their self-autonomy to be able to regulate themselves. China wants Taiwan back. Why? It's simple. Imperialism. China is doing its best to try to take over many parts in the world, and I'm not saying the United States didn't do the same thing. I think the United States always enticed people. You become part of the United States, and we'll actually help you with lots of money and our technology. But China is imperialistic, militarily speaking, and Taiwan is the main country in their crosshairs. And since Taiwan, at least for trade reasons, we actually bring in a lot of stuff from Taiwan. We, the United States, as the world policemen, are setting it up saying, you cannot do this, China. We will defend Taiwan. At the very least, it's because of the microchips, which that's another problem we have too. The microchip shortage, because a lot of the gases that are actually produced to make microchips, we have to have neon. And a lot of the neon came from parts of Russia and Ukraine specifically, which those plants are very much having a difficult time now. And if we can't have the neon, then we can't produce the lasers that can't etch the microchips. And with China has 80% of the microchip area covered when it comes to crappy microchips. So all those little type of gizmos that you buy that your coffee maker can turn on in the morning for you and such, a lot of that stuff's made in China, and it comes down to the point where they have almost a monopoly on that situation. But the chips that actually make, you ready for this? Our military equipment, our cars, etc., our cell phones, come from areas in which we're having a difficult time getting the neon because of Ukraine. China makes its own neon, so therefore they can actually make their own microchips. But can you see how another reason why they would be motivated to try to get Taiwan being part of them again, because now they can actually even more have a monopoly on microchips and therefore have another stranglehold on the United States as far as our military and technology goes. It's a difficult situation all the way around. And I know a lot of people perceive this simply as saber rattling. Oh, you're just saber rattling. This is not going to be war. And I truly hope it doesn't, because understand, if this war does break out, it's not going to be just Russia with a conscription of military. The United States will reinstate the draft. You have to understand this. And the liberals, the Democrats. I mean, I even hate to say Democrats, because Democrats stand for a lot of good things, when we're actually looking at middle of the road. Throughout years, we've always had middle of the road where we all work together and try to make things happen. I'm not saying I completely love everything the Republicans are doing either. But it's this far left progressive system that is taking over and pushing all their agenda, has a couple times now seriously taken a look at not only just reinstating the draft, but the registration for the draft will also include our daughters as well, not just our boys, but our girls. And that's the state America's looking in as we're heading into potentially World War III. But just like we saw World War I, World War II, all these problems kicking in. Before World War II, we actually had a worldwide depression. The inflation and the amount of money we're borrowing in the United States is simply staggering. And because of that, we're seeing massive inflation. We're seeing people not being able to work because companies are shutting down. The list of even major corporations shutting down is crazy as they switch to AI, as they switch to robotic control. They're literally setting up a brand new class. It's called the worthless class is what they tag it, in which so many people will not be able to work. On top of, because of this education system, this full circle, a lot of people don't want to work. They want to sit home, play their PS5, get some takeout. Hey, DoorDash, bring me my food. I don't even want to go to the door for this. And become our next generation of fat people sitting in lazy chairs so they can actually not worry about working at all. This is a change that has to be made to stop this now. Motivate people of America to want to work, to be innovative, to actually take on those roles of actually being a great country again. We have to do this because America has already started this trend where we're sending things downhill. And all the events across the world right now are simply exacerbating the problem. And we're heading down a very slippery slope. Unless we actually reverse course now, America will easily fall below being that world leader into a country that we, the people, will no longer recognize. A country in which our freedoms are taken for safety and security. That's what they claim anyway. But it's easy when that happens because, you know what? It's tough to get out of that big old lazy chair when you're so fat. How are you supposed to take action in anything? And that's exactly where they have us. Okay, so much more we could talk about. We could talk for an hour more about the state of the union where we're at, and I'm sure we will in the future. But I would like this. Again, I would like a conversation to be brought up below. I would like to hear your thoughts on this whole thing too. Of course, being respectful, opinions for everybody is welcome here. But I do say this. I would like to know what you think about podcast. Is this something you would enjoy on Sundays? Well, we did this one specifically in lieu because we will not be live this evening, but at least we have the podcast we can listen to, and we actually have a good long podcast to be able to think about and understand the reason to prep. Because at Goshen Prepping, it's not simply showing you what's happening in the world today, which is huge, but it's also trying to get you prepared so you can live through this whole thing that's coming. Because you know what? The last time this happened, the Great Depression, World War II, many millions of people did not live through it. And our goal is to make it through this alive and see each other on the other side. Not the other side death-wise, but the other side as far as when it's all over and done with. All right. Thanks for watching. We always appreciate you. And I hope you enjoyed this podcast and I hope it worked well. And if so, we will do more in the future. Have a great Sunday.